My name is Alina Voss, and I was 36 years old the morning a demolition crew showed up at my grandmother's century-old harbor warehouse in Charleston, South Carolina, with a permit signed by a city inspector, a quitclaim deed bearing my grandmother's signature, and a foreman who told me, not unkindly, that I had exactly 40 minutes to remove anything I wanted to keep before the wrecking ball arrived. I want you to remember that number, 40 minutes, because 11 weeks later, that same foreman was going to stand in a Charleston courtroom and testify that the deed he'd been shown that morning had never actually existed in any county record before 6 months earlier, and that the signature on it belonged to a woman who'd been dead for 2 years before the date typed at the bottom of the page. Welcome back to Silent Mirror Stories, the channel where hidden truths finally find their reflection, and quiet people learn exactly what silence can protect. If you've ever watched someone confidently destroy something they never actually had the right to touch, this story is for you. Stay with me, because I want to walk you through every year that led to that morning, not just the demolition crew itself, since the ending only means something once you understand exactly what they thought they'd gotten away with. I work as an architectural restoration specialist, the kind of work most people never think about until they need it, spending my career carefully documenting, dismantling, and rebuilding historic structures across the Carolinas, from antebellum plantation outbuildings to Gilded Age commercial warehouses. Work that has taught me, over 12 years, exactly how much of a building's history lives in details most people never bother examining: mortar composition, hand-forged hardware, the specific grain pattern of century-old heart pine, and, increasingly over my career, the legal and documentary history that determines who actually has the right to touch any of it in the first place. I grew up in Charleston, the granddaughter of Miriam Voss, a woman who'd inherited a modest but genuinely significant piece of the city's working waterfront, a single-story brick warehouse on a private pier off Concord Street, built in 1891 by her own grandfather to store and ship the cotton and rice that had once moved through that harbor by the thousands of bales. By the time I was born, the warehouse no longer handled cargo, but my grandmother had refused, for decades, every developer's offer to buy the property. Converting the ground floor instead into a small maritime museum, she operated largely as a passion project, a space that told the specific, unglamorous story of Charleston's black stevedores and dockworkers. A history she felt strongly deserved preservation, considerably more than any luxury condominium. The waterfront's increasingly aggressive development pressure kept trying to build in its place. I want to describe my relationship with my grandmother specifically, because it matters enormously to understanding everything that eventually happened. I spent nearly every summer of my childhood at that warehouse, and later, throughout my 20s and 30s, considerable additional time helping her maintain the structure itself. Work that shaped, in a genuine and direct way, my eventual career choice to specialize in exactly this kind of historic preservation. My grandmother often told me, only half joking, that she'd raised a granddaughter specifically capable of protecting the building after she was gone, a comment I understood at the time as simple affectionate pride rather than the specific, prescient concern it eventually turned out to be. My father, Charles Voss, my grandmother's only son, held a considerably different relationship with the property, having left Charleston in his 20s for a career in commercial real estate development in Atlanta. A career that, over the following decades, positioned him philosophically and practically on almost the opposite side of every value my grandmother held regarding the warehouse's preservation. My father visited Charleston infrequently, and when he did, conversations about the warehouse consistently circled back to its potential value if sold and redeveloped, conversations my grandmother generally deflected with the same patient, immovable firmness she brought to most disagreements throughout her long life. I want to be honest about the specific dynamic that developed within our family over the years, because it shapes everything that eventually happened. My father's second wife, Renata, whom he married roughly 15 years ago following my parents' divorce, brought with her a son from her own previous marriage, my stepbrother, Kyle, who was, by the time this story actually begins, running his own commercial development firm in partnership with my father. a firm that specialized specifically in acquiring undervalued historic waterfront properties and converting them into high-end mixed-use developments. Work that made the eventual value of my grandmother's warehouse property, sitting on some of the last remaining private pier frontage in that specific stretch of Charleston's harbor, an obvious and increasingly tempting target for exactly the kind of project Kyle's firm specialized in. My grandmother passed 2 years ago, at 89, peacefully, in the same house she'd lived in for over 5 decades. Her will, which I want to describe specifically, because its exact terms matter enormously to everything that followed, left the warehouse property directly to me, along with a modest endowment specifically earmarked for continuing the Maritime Museum's operations, while leaving her remaining assets, considerably more liquid and considerably larger in overall value given her broader investment portfolio, divided between my father and through a separate trust, myself as well. I want to be honest that this specific division generated, even at the time of the will's reading, a visible tension within our family. My father, and considerably more directly, Kyle, expressed what I initially understood as simple disappointment that the warehouse property, rather than being sold and its proceeds distributed among the broader family, had instead passed directly and solely to me, a decision my grandmother's attorney explained, reading from a personal letter she'd left specifically addressing this choice, reflected her clear, considered belief that I was the only family member who genuinely understood and valued what the property represented beyond its simple market value. I formally inherited the warehouse 18 months before that demolition crew arrived, and I want to describe honestly how I approached that inheritance, because it matters to understanding exactly how blindsided I initially was by what eventually happened. I continued operating the small maritime museum largely as my grandmother had, while also beginning. Using my own professional expertise, a careful, methodical restoration of certain structural elements the building genuinely needed after over a century of harbor exposure. Work I funded partly through the endowment my grandmother had left and partly through my own savings. Understanding this project as both a professional undertaking and a genuine act of continuing my grandmother's specific legacy. I want to describe the specific moment when this entire situation began revealing itself, roughly 4 months before that demolition crew's arrival. I received, unexpectedly, a certified letter from an attorney I didn't recognize, representing an entity called Harborview Development Partners, informing me that the firm held clear title to the warehouse property, effective as of a quitclaim deed recorded 6 months earlier, and requesting, formally, that I vacate the premises within 30 days to allow the property's planned redevelopment to proceed. I want to describe honestly what I felt reading that letter, because I think it matters to understanding my subsequent, deliberately methodical response. I felt, initially, a specific, genuine confusion rather than immediate alarm, understanding, professionally, exactly what a properly executed and recorded deed actually represents legally, and understanding, equally clearly, that no such transaction had ever occurred, since I remained, as far as I knew with complete certainty, the property's sole legal owner following my grandmother's clearly documented will. I contacted the Charleston County Register of Deeds office directly the following morning and confirmed, with a specific dread that settled in my stomach as the county clerk pulled up the actual document, that a quitclaim deed had indeed been recorded exactly as the letter described, purporting to transfer the warehouse property from my grandmother, Miriam Voss, directly to Harborview Development Partners, dated and signed roughly 8 months earlier. I want to describe the specific problem with this document because it's the detail that eventually unraveled the entire fraud. My grandmother had died 2 years before that recorded deed's stated signing date. The document purported to bear her signature, notarized by a notary whose credentials, I would later confirm, had actually expired 11 months before the notarization date printed on the document itself, on a deed executed, according to its own paperwork, by a woman who had already been dead for a full year at the time it claimed she'd signed it. I want to be honest about the specific decision I made at this point, understanding, professionally, exactly how significant a discovery this actually represented. I didn't immediately confront Harborview Development Partners, or, notably, my father and Kyle, whose firm I'd already begun to suspect, based on nothing more than the specific timing and nature of this fraud, might hold some connection to whatever entity had actually orchestrated it. I decided instead to build the same kind of thorough, methodical documentation I'd spent my entire career learning to construct around historic properties, applying that exact professional discipline to uncovering exactly how this fraudulent deed had been created and by whom. I want to describe the following several weeks honestly, because I think the specific detective work matters considerably to understanding everything that eventually happened. I retained a real estate fraud attorney, a careful, precise woman named Patricia Alvarez in Charleston, who confirmed my own initial legal analysis while helping me formally request the complete recorded documentation surrounding the fraudulent deeds filing. This documentation revealed, gradually, a paper trail that led, unmistakably, back toward exactly the family members I'd initially suspected, but had genuinely hoped weren't actually involved. Harborview Development Partners, according to public business registration records Patricia helped me trace, was a limited liability company formed roughly 10 months earlier. Its registered agent listed as an attorney whose office, further investigation revealed, had previously handled several transactions for Kyle's own development firm. The notary whose expired credentials appeared on the fraudulent deed, I discovered through a considerably more difficult investigation involving a private investigator Patricia recommended, turned out to be a former administrative employee of that same law firm, someone who'd left the position roughly a year before the fraudulent deed's execution date, but whose notary stamp, apparently, had never been formally deactivated or reported as compromised. I want to describe the specific evening when the full scope of this fraud became genuinely clear to me, because I think it matters to understanding my eventual, considerably calculated response. Patricia's investigation, combined with financial records her office subpoenaed through the fraud litigation we'd formally initiated, revealed that Harborview Development Partners had, in the months following that fraudulent deeds recording, secured a substantial private equity construction loan, using the warehouse property as collateral, a loan structured specifically to fund the exact kind of high-end waterfront redevelopment Kyle's firm specialized in, complete with architectural renderings. Already prepared, depicting a 6-unit luxury condominium building where my grandmother's warehouse currently stood. I want to be honest about what I felt discovering this complete picture, because I think it matters to understanding everything that happened next. I felt something considerably colder and more focused than simple anger, understanding, in that moment, that my own father and stepbrother had apparently orchestrated an elaborate, deliberate fraud against my grandmother's estate, forging her signature on a document she couldn't possibly have signed, specifically to seize a property that, whatever its market value, represented something my grandmother had spent decades explicitly protecting from exactly this kind of development. I want to describe the specific decision I made at this point, because I think it reveals something important about how I chose to handle what I now understood was genuine criminal fraud rather than simply a family disagreement. Rather than immediately confronting my father and Kyle directly, which I understood, professionally, would likely give them the opportunity to destroy or alter evidence before formal legal action could freeze it in place, I worked with Patricia to file, quietly and without any advance notice to the opposing parties, a formal fraud complaint with the Charleston County Sheriff's Office, along with a simultaneous civil action seeking an emergency injunction against any further action on the property, including, critically, any demolition or construction activity. I want to describe the specific timing that ultimately explains that demolition crew's morning arrival, because the sequence matters enormously to understanding exactly how close this fraud came to actually succeeding despite the legal process I'd already initiated. The injunction I'd requested had been filed, but hadn't yet been formally served and entered by the court, a bureaucratic gap of roughly 9 days that Kyle and Harborview Development Partners, apparently unaware that any legal challenge existed at all, used to finalize their demolition permits, and schedule what they clearly intended as a swift, decisive move to physically eliminate the building before any dispute could meaningfully interfere with their plans. I want to describe that morning itself, because I think the specific details matter to understanding exactly how I responded once I arrived to find the demolition crew already assembled. I'd received, the previous evening, a routine notification from my own property management service that unusual activity had been recorded at the warehouse, prompting me to drive there immediately that morning, arriving to find a demolition foreman, a stack of paperwork including that fraudulent deed, and a genuine, active demolition permit issued by the city, apparently processed based entirely on Harborview's fraudulent claim of clear title. I told the foreman, calmly and directly, that I held documented proof this deed was fraudulent, that a civil fraud action and criminal complaint were already filed regarding this exact property, and that proceeding with demolition would expose him and his crew to considerable legal liability, given what I could show him immediately on my phone: screenshots of the county records confirming my grandmother's actual death date against the deed's impossible signing date. I want to describe the foreman's reaction honestly, because it matters to understanding how quickly this specific crisis actually resolved once genuine documentation entered the situation. He was, understandably, considerably more cautious once I laid out the specific dates involved, a discrepancy simple enough that he immediately recognized its significance. And he agreed, while I called Patricia directly from the site, to pause any work while she coordinated an emergency call with the city's permitting office to formally suspend the demolition authorization pending review. I want to describe the following several weeks honestly, because I think the specific unfolding matters considerably to understanding exactly how thoroughly this fraud eventually collapsed once genuine scrutiny applied to it. Patricia's office formally served the emergency injunction within days, along with subpoenas covering Harborview's complete financial and legal records. The sheriff's office fraud investigation, working in parallel, quickly identified the specific connection between Harborview's registered agent and Kyle's own development firm, along with financial records showing that Kyle himself had personally guaranteed a portion of the construction loan the fraudulent deed had secured. I want to describe the specific confrontation that eventually occurred, roughly 6 weeks after that demolition morning, because I think it reveals, clearly, exactly how completely my father and Kyle had convinced themselves this fraud would proceed unchallenged. Kyle's attorney contacted Patricia, apparently hoping to negotiate some quiet, private settlement before formal criminal charges proceeded further, an offer that revealed, I think, genuine panic rather than any actual confidence in their underlying legal position. I insisted, through Patricia, that any resolution proceed entirely through formal legal channels, understanding, professionally, that a private, quiet settlement would allow my father and Kyle to avoid the actual accountability this deliberate, calculated fraud genuinely warranted, particularly given how specifically and knowingly they'd forged a dead woman's signature to seize property she'd spent decades explicitly protecting. I want to describe the eventual courtroom proceeding, roughly 11 weeks after that demolition morning, because I think the specific testimony matters to understanding exactly how this entire fraud finally, fully collapsed. The demolition foreman testified, exactly as I'd anticipated once the full timeline became clear, confirming that the deed he'd been shown that morning listed a signing date that fell after my grandmother's documented date of death, testimony that, combined with the notary's expired credentials and the direct financial links Patricia's investigation had traced between Harborview and Kyle's own firm, established the fraud's full scope beyond any reasonable dispute. Kyle was formally indicted on charges of forgery and fraud roughly 2 weeks after that hearing, charges that, I want to be honest, generated a genuinely painful rupture within my family, my father's own position considerably more legally ambiguous throughout the investigation, though civil discovery eventually revealed enough of his direct involvement in structuring Harborview's formation that he faced separate civil liability, if not criminal charges himself, for his role in the underlying scheme. I want to be honest about where things stand now, several months out from that courtroom testimony, because I don't think a fully clean, comfortable family resolution accurately represents everything that's happened since. My relationship with my father remains, essentially, non-existent, a rupture I understand as the genuine, painful cost of what he chose to do. A cost I've made peace with rather than continuing to hope for some reconciliation that his own actions made, I think, genuinely impossible to pursue with any real integrity. The warehouse itself remains mine, fully restored to clear title once the fraudulent deed was formally voided by the court, and I've continued the restoration work I'd already begun before this entire situation unfolded. Work that feels, now, considerably more meaningful given everything the building survived to remain standing at all. I still keep the complete case file Patricia and I assembled throughout this process. The county records, the financial documentation, the notary's expired credentials, stored carefully in my own office alongside the restoration records for the building itself. I keep it not out of any ongoing bitterness, but as a specific, professional reminder of something my grandmother understood clearly, decades before any of this became necessary, that protecting something genuinely meaningful sometimes requires the same patient, careful documentation that historic preservation itself demands, understanding exactly what belongs where, and exactly what story the actual, undeniable evidence tells, regardless of how confidently someone else tries to rewrite it. My father and stepbrother forged my grandmother's signature on a deed dated after her death, certain that a fast demolition would eliminate the evidence before anyone could examine the timeline closely enough to notice. What they discovered, 11 weeks and one courtroom testimony later, was that the exact kind of careful, detailed documentation historic preservation requires, the ability to trace a building's true history back through every layer someone might try to obscure, was precisely the skill I'd spent my entire career mastering, applied, in the end, not to a century-old warehouse, but to the fraud they genuinely believed no one would ever bother examining closely enough to catch. That's my story. One demolition morning, one impossible signing date, and a lifetime of learning to read the true history hidden beneath whatever story someone else tries to tell instead. If you've ever watched someone confidently build something on a foundation that was never actually theirs to build on, I hope you found something in this that reflected back at you clearly. Tell me in the comments, would you have handled it the same quiet, methodical way, or confronted them the moment you found out? And make sure you're subscribed to Silent Mirror Stories, because there's a new story like this one every day.